So, Mr. Chairman, we have a quorum.
Thank you, Alex. Open it up for the public forum next. Is there any members of the public that here to address the board? Hearing none, we'll move into the minutes of August 26th, our last quarterly meeting. I'd ask for a motion in a second to consider these minutes.
I'll motion.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Is there any correction or discussion that anyone would like to bring forward on these minutes before we take a vote? Seeing there's so many on remote today, I'll just ask as we did prior, is there anyone who's opposed to the adoption of these minutes? Hearing none, we'll consider the minutes approved. Also like to inform you that the October 21st and that November 18th planning committee meeting minutes were provided, those draft in the information prior to our meeting. Jim, if you would please, communication and announcements.
Well, I'm happy to announce, Lori just told me that we got the WebEx, the live stream feeding, so if anybody else joins us from the public, they'll get it. The more standard announcements, due to the resignation of Lovely Warren, James Smith is the acting mayor for the city of Rochester and is a member of GTC until Malik Evans is sworn in as mayor on January 1st. Hope Knight has been named the acting commissioner of the Empire State Development Corporation and is therefore a member of GTC. That concludes my announcements.
Thank you. We'll move into reports and actions on old business. I'd like to ask Scott Weatherstitch to please provide a report on the planning committee.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Happy holidays to everyone. The Planning Committee met on October 14th and November 18th and recommends that the GTC board accept reports as evidence of completion of 8 unified planning work program tasks. They are the Regional Land Use Monitoring 2020, the I-490 Integrated Corridor Management Plan, the Monroe County High Accident Location Program 2020 to 2021, the State Route 332 and Route 96 Sub-Area Study, the Livingston County Mobility Management Strategy, the Ontario Midland Strategic Plan, the Canandaigua Waterfront Active Transportation Plan, and the Monroe County Traffic Signal Sign Pole Assessment Management Project. We also amended the federal fiscal year 2020 to 2024 Transportation Improvement Program as requested by the New York State Department of Transportation. And we affirmed the 2022 Genesee Transportation Council host agency agreement between the New York State Department of Transportation and GTCS Incorporated. Additionally, the Planning Committee took the following actions. We approved scopes of work for 2 UPWP tasks. They are the Regional Traffic Operations Center Strategic Plan, Cross Asset Highway and Bridge Evaluation and Prioritization Tool. We also approved 3 administrative modifications for the federal fiscal year 2020 to 2024 Transportation Improvement Program, as requested by the Ontario County and the New York State Department of Transportation. They are increasing the total cost of Talliard Road over Flint Creek Bridge Replacement Project, increasing the total cost of the Route 204 Brooks Avenue from Route 33A to Rochester City Line Project, and then also increasing the total cost of the Route 414 over CSX Bridge Rehab Project. We approved the terms for the Active Transportation Advisory Group. Be happy to entertain any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Scott. Hearing no questions, we'll move into the GTC staff report, please, Jim.
Thank you. So outside of the planning closeouts that Scott just mentioned, the biggest activity that staff has had is working on our next Unified Planning Work Program, or UPWP that we call it, and that establishes our annual work program. The next one will commence April 1st. We did solicit project call for project partnerships, so communities throughout the region could submit proposals. Our UPWP Development Committee has screened and evaluated those proposals and has come up with a recommended set of projects that will be presented to the Planning Committee at their January meeting. That will then be made available for a 30-day public review. The Planning Committee will make a final recommendation at their February meeting, and the UPWP, recommended UPWP will be presented to this board in February for consideration of adoption. And that's the major staff item.
Thanks, Jim. Going to move into old business. Due to our late start, Jim has prepared kind of a presentation on federal and legislative funding update. We're going to do that after we take care of the action items. I also want to inform the board that the TIP staff modification report is included in the meeting package. And if there's any questions at this time, staff can answer them. Also under old business, I'll ask Jim to briefly discuss the active transportation advisory group.
Thank you. So as you'll recall, I raised the concept of the Active Transportation Advisory Group at the meeting in August, and the board was supportive of the concept and delegated responsibility for working out all the terms to the Planning Committee, as it would be an advisory group to the Planning Committee. There was an initial discussion at the October meeting, and where staff had presented some draft terms, like a term sheet for how the group would operate, and then took some feedback and came back in November for final adoption of the term sheets. Really, the big difference between the draft term and the final term was just to clarify that the group would offer perspectives on capital projects that come through the TIP, and then possibly raise ideas for planning studies through the UPWP. Initially, it wasn't very clear. It could have been read to say that that group would have project selection, which was not the intention. So that has been finalized, and after the holidays, we'll get it moving forward. Not the best time to activate a new advisory group, so Bob Williams on our staff will do that effort.
Very good. Thank you, Jim. We do have some action items this morning. I'll ask if there's any objection by a member or an alternate to basically lump the UPWP closeouts under one action. Hearing no objection, I'd ask for a motion in a second so we can get an overview of these closeouts.
Genesee.
Mr. Reeves, second.
Thank you. We have a motion in a second. Jim, if you would please, an overview for some discussion.
Sure, thank you. So proposed resolutions 2182 through 2189, I'm sorry, 88 were reviewed and recommended for your approval by the Planning Committee at its October meeting, while resolution 2189 was reviewed and recommended at the November meeting. Summaries of each project were included in the meeting materials. The first one, the Regional Land Use Monitoring 2020, this project was conducted by the Genesee Finger Lakes Regional Planning Council. The purpose of the project was to document land use and development trends throughout the region for use by GTC and other member agencies. One of the primary uses of this data is updating our regional travel demand model. So the report collects and compiles information on residential, industrial, commercial, community service, and mixed use permits throughout the calendar year. In order to accomplish this, GFL RPC staff distributed a survey to all municipalities and then supplemented the data collection with information from the Census Bureau and the New York State Uniform Code annual report. Staff was able to achieve a 97% response rate, which was pretty good. And then some of the key trends for 2020, the top residential permits were issued in the city of Rochester with 778 units, the town of Henrietta with 278 units, and the town of Irondequoit with 270 units. But throughout the region, there were also 18 industrial permits and 55 commercial permits in the region. And you'll recall from the last meeting, Monroe County had a similar closeout. The Regional Planning Council in Monroe County coordinate their efforts throughout, so it's a seamless product across the two groups. The next project is the I-490 Integrated Corridor Management Plan. This is a project that was conducted by Gtc staff, and the study objective is actually twofold. The first was to develop a guide for future investments in ITS, which is Intelligent Transportation Systems. That's the field equipment that helps traffic operations go a little smoother. Probably the most visible thing you would see is those message boards that say, hey, crash ahead, or so much time to get to the exit waypoint. The second was to identify operational strategies aimed at improving the safety, minimizing delay, and enhancing traffic operations along the whole corridor. And the study area did include the entire I-490 corridor, about 38-mile stretch from Leroy to Victor. The planning process included development of an inventory that included identification of gaps and needs, a review of potential ICM and the integrated corridor management strategies, and the development of recommendations throughout the corridor. Those recommendations were grouped into three major categories. The first was ITS infrastructure, the equipment needed to collect and relay the information. It was also an effort to identify the location of future placement of equipment along the corridor. The second focus area of the recommendations was operations and policy, which identified actions to manage traffic and incidents, to obtain traffic operations data, and to conduct asset management. So the idea of how do you maintain what's out there, what is your replacement cycle, and the like. And then the third is related to a regional ITS architecture. This is a document that's maintained by the Gtc staff that basically identifies all the different ITS elements across agencies and the information flows between them, and is really sort of the backbone diagram that allows federal funds to flow to those projects. If a project's not included in the ITS architecture, it cannot get federal ITS funds. So that's important, but we wanted to update the architecture to incorporate the ICM approach, and so future projects can be funded with federal funds. Next, we have the Monroe County High Action Location Program. And this program was conducted by Monroe County Department of Transportation staff, and the purpose was to perform a detailed analysis of each location identified as a priority investigation location. These are identified through crash statistics. After they identified the location, they evaluated potential countermeasures as well as specific safety recommendations. You have to understand the type of crashes before you can understand the correct fix. So each year, Monroe County DOT identifies a new set of locations to be analyzed. For the 2020 program, 11 intersections and 17 road segments were identified and analyzed. In order to establish the crash rate, Monroe County looks at 5-year crash history, and then those locations that have a higher crash rate than expected for county-owned facilities are then analyzed. From the previous list, 4 locations that were identified as priority incident locations were removed because the 5-year crash rate showed, crash analysis showed that the location was getting better and no longer needed to be studied. Recommendations resulting from the investigations include things like new turn lanes, new signs or signal enhancements, new pavement markings, and a number of these improvements have been incorporated into planned capital projects as they do the design, and others will be implemented by county DOT forces or City of Rochester DES forces. So they tend to be low-cost fixes that are relatively easy to implement. Moving on to the State Route 332 and Route 96 sub-area study. This project was conducted by Ontario County. The purpose of the project was to develop an access management plan for the study area, to preserve Route 332 and 96 traffic operations. The study assessed the transportation system, the operations, and potential impacts of existing and future land uses along these two corridors. There's tremendous development pressures in that part of Farmington. The study findings form the foundation for proposed improvements to address safety and connectivity for all modes of travel. There were recommendations focusing on reconfiguring those existing roadways, modifying access management policies so that sites can be more easily accessed and egressed. There were recommendations related to local land use regulations, and that was an effort to support town policies and initiatives for future land development, and then also some preservation practices on the land use side to preserve the community character and lessen the impact on the corridors. The Livingston County Mobility Management Strategy was conducted by Livingston County. The purpose of this project was to develop a tool that analyzes existing mobility management in Livingston County. They were specifically looking at program level transportation demand through the county human service agencies, so things like Child Protective Services, Office for the Aging, some drug rehabilitation, the various services that people need transportation. The project involved exploring programming efficiencies, public funding sources, and existing contracts to develop recommendations that fit the needs of the county. And the first recommendation involved improving the functionality of the Ride Livingston portal, right, that is out there to help identify trip opportunities, but they want to add functionality to book the trip and make payments for the trip. The Arc of Glow region was recently hired to provide mobility management services, and part of their contract was to utilize this portal to basically be informed of the trips and help make those connections. There are further recommendations to develop a trip exchange between agencies, both within and outside the county. Right now, each agency is only able to book the trip within its own agency, not across agencies. There is also looking at the ability for the portal to be expanded to serve as a platform that can enable collaboration at a larger scale, both geographically and with a number of agencies participating. And although not part of the study, but related, Monroe County and Ontario counties have been working together on a multi-county mobility management strategy, and they were awarded some funding from the FTA Section 5310 program, which funds vehicles and mobility management for elderly and disabled programs. So they are currently working with Livingston County to explore the possibility of expanding that platform to serve all three counties. So that's an exciting potential opportunity that if they're working through a common platform, the functionality that's already been demonstrated can be expanded, and the ability to service individuals across county lines becomes a possibility. And we're particularly some of the specialized facilities in the county, having that ability is key. And you know, if it's successful to go to those three counties, then there's potential to grow, continue to grow to adjacent counties. The Ontario Midland Strategic Plan was conducted by Wayne County, and the purpose of this project was to develop a freight corridor strategic plan for the Ontario Midland Short Line Railroad through Wayne County. The railroad is a short line primarily in Wayne County. There is a small touch on Northern Ontario County. The project began with an inventory of existing conditions that focused on land use, infrastructure, utilities, environmental considerations, and the rail network and operations. A rail-enabled business opportunity analysis was conducted. This would look for those businesses that are conducive to locating along a rail corridor and having rail access. And we know how important agriculture is in our region, so the idea of moving stuff out on trains instead of trucks is a potential. The analyses focus on individual and commodity-based business opportunities. There was outreach and engagement conducted throughout the study with current users of the railroad. Excuse me, based on the findings, development profiles were completed, and individual sites and target areas were identified for the county IDA to follow up on. Finally, recommendations were provided for 3 categories, that being baseline, strategic, and target areas. So, and really it turned out to be 4 geographic areas of the rail line. So the recommendations were centered around each. Cost estimates for potential improvements were developed and recommendations were prioritized for when funding becomes available or strategic opportunities have priority to follow. The Canandaigua Waterfront Active Transportation Plan was conducted by the City of Canandaigua. The objective of this project was to assess the physical and market conditions of the area, to form decision-making around a range of public realm improvements along the corridor, such as bicycle and pedestrian improvements and amenities, and also some roadway modifications to make it easier for traveling through the corridor. The corridor transitions from mixed-use retail setting on one end to a recreational and tourism-focused area along Canandaigua Lake. The recommended improvements along the corridor are intended to enhance the safe routes of transportation for all types of users. There are specific recommendations to improve travel for bicyclists and pedestrians, and there are other key improvements include potential for a roundabout at Lakeshore Drive and City Pier intersection, sidewalk and crosswalk enhancements along Lakeshore Drive, and multi-use side path on the south side of Lakeshore Drive, extending the Route 364. So character change for sure in that area if it goes through. The final project is the Monroe County Traffic Signal and Sign Pole Asset Management Plan. This was conducted by the Monroe County Department of Transportation. The purpose of the project was to create a county-wide inventory of all sign poles, traffic signal poles, and associated traffic signal equipment maintained by the county. Data was collected at nearly 670 locations, and they incorporated all the data from condition assessment and photos into a GIS-based inventory. The consultant team developed a project-specific data collection form, and that was installed on smartphones so they can go out in the field and obtain data for specific features of the signal poles, the control cabinets, the pole boxes, and the sign poles. And that information was added to the GIS database in real time that allowed the stakeholders, being the county, but even the consultant team, to track the progress and allow for immediate quality control review. So if something went wrong, they can redo it in the field instead of having to revisit. A condition assessment was conducted using visual ratings for various components of the traffic signals and poles. Monroe County DOT will be reviewing the report for future programming as they do capital projects and possibly a specific traffic signal project where repairs or upgrades might be needed. Some of the poles are decades old, and there has been some design poles that was prevalent decades ago, and they've come to realize that some of the metal fatigue is problematic, and this is not unique to Monroe County, but so it's an issue that the traffic operations folks have it top of mind. With that, I will try to answer any questions anybody has.
Thanks, Jim. Anyone have any questions or discussion on these closeouts? Hearing none, I'd ask, is there anyone opposed to adopting this action? Hearing none, we'll consider these closeouts adopted. Next, we do have one TIP amendment, and would ask for a motion in a second to bring it to the floor.
So moved.
Thank you. We have a motion in a second. Jim, if you would please overview on this one item.
Yes, shockingly, only one tip amendment this time around, but the resolution for this item was reviewed and recommended for your approval by the planning committee in November. You'll notice in the resolution, there are multiple rail crossings. The individual railroad crossings were selected on a statewide basis through the Railway Highway Crossings Program. It's Section 130. For anybody that really needs to know, that's the funding program. This is managed by NISDOT main office in Albany. The planning committee recommended that all the projects be considered under a single resolution just to facilitate. But they also recommended that you authorize me to make future project costs and project schedule changes for these locations as staff modifications instead of having to come back to the board. And this is allowed for in our TIP procedures manual and similar to what we did for Bridge New York, where for the statewide program, funds comes for a specific project, but sometimes during project development, there's schedule changes or cost changes, and to expedite those changes, the authority would be vested in me and not have to wait for reporting.
Thanks, Jim. Is there any questions or discussion on this amendment? Hearing none, I'd ask if there's anyone opposed to this amendment. Hearing none, we'll consider this amendment adopted or passed, so to speak. We'd look for a motion in a second for Jim to provide an overview for our host agency agreement.
So moved.
Have a motion in a second. Jim, if you would please, overview.
Sure. Resolution 21-91 was reviewed and recommended for approval by the planning committee in November. Just by way of background, GTC as an entity is a group of appointed and elected officials, so there's not really a corporate entity associated with the council, but in order for us to conduct business, we have to have a host agency. And for GTC, that host agency has been GTCS Inc., which is a subsidiary of RGRTA. It was established in 1997, and the board of directors for GTCS Inc. is the same as the board of commissioners for RGRTA. So the host agency agreement is necessary to allow for financial obligations such as entering into contracts. It provides staff support, payroll, accounting, legal, so we have operational support as well for the council. The current agreement was initially executed on August 18th, 1977. It has been extended multiple times, and the most recent extension was April 1, 2012, that extended through March 31st, 2022. So a new host agency agreement is necessary to continue operations at GTC. GTC and RGRTA staffs worked with NISDOT main office to develop the new host agency agreement. Essentially, there was an effort 10 years ago to get all the MPOs in line, initiated by the Office State Comptroller. So we're all working from the same agreement template. We're all working on the same cycle. So our review this time around was really assuring dates and addresses. Everything else was pretty straightforward, but the RGRTA legal counsel did review it. So this agreement was presented to GTCS Inc. and it was approved last week on December 2nd. Although this board is not a party to the agreement, so that makes it, we don't need to formally approve the agreement at this table, but by affirming the agreement, we're indicating full support to continue the arrangement for another 10 years.
Thanks, Jim. Does anybody have any discussion on this?
Been working well since 1977.
I would just say they're a very good subsidiary and very effective. We're very proud to hold them under the RGRTA.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other comments or discussion? Hearing none, is there anyone opposed for this agreement to continue? Hearing none, we'll say that we don't have to vote for it, but we're in support.
Well, it's still
We're voting, but we're in support of the agreement moving forward. Do you want to give that legislative and funding update for new business, Jim? Or would you want to go into new first?
Well, we probably should go into new business in case there's anything that needs a vote before we lose people.
We'll do that. Is there any new business to be brought before us this morning? Hearing none, this will go back to the report now.
Yeah, so we'll go back to the presentation and the federal funding update. I recognize that people might have conflicts. We take no offense if anybody needs to drop off. The action items that require a quorum are done, so we don't have to worry about losing a quorum. The rest is just informational. All right, so as folks have probably seen, there's been a significant activity in Congress related to an infrastructure package. And while negotiations were underway, congressional action was needed to enact a continuing resolution that kept the government operating without the 12 budget appropriations acts that are needed to get the new federal fiscal year moving. The continuing resolutions authorize the continuation of the existing programs at the existing fund levels from one federal fiscal year to the next. So we don't get to take advantage of any new things. New changes must be achieved through the typical legislative and budget process. So our rules are stuck until such time as Congress takes full action. But the first continuing resolution funded federal government from September 30th, or actually October 1st, to December 3rd. And because Congress was taking action to give more time for negotiations, the second continuing resolution was enacted to fund the government from December 3rd to February 18th. So we're under a continuing resolution right now. But as Congress and the administration were negotiating the larger infrastructure package, we were also up against the FAST Act for surface transportation expiring. That had been scheduled to expire September 30th. Congress did extend it from October 1st to October 31st. And as they didn't quite finish up what they were hoping to do, they extended again through December 3rd. The FAST Act through December 3rd. So just to give a little bit of a refresher on how refresher for some, a primer for others, on how the federal funds flow from Washington to our region. We got a little diagram that explains it. So the first thing we have is a multi-year authorization for surface transportation programs for the federal fiscal year. And I'm sorry the TV is so far away, it's hard for folks to see. But it is available. The slideshow will be available on our website. Funding is then appropriated by federal fiscal year, and certain funds become subject to the annual appropriations process, even though they're authorized in the FAST Act. The funds are distributed to states via formula. Those formula funds then, when they're apportioned to each state, each funding program has formulas for how it gets distributed to each state. And then each state determines how they're going to distribute the funds within those federal rules throughout the state. New York State distributes its funds to regions that are covered by MPOs like GTC, and they do that based on formulas. These are referred to as regional planning targets. Our TIP development process programs our projects to those regional planning targets. The TIP must be fiscally constrained. That is, we cannot program more projects that are more value than we have in our planning targets to cover. So the one good thing is it's not a wish list, but it's also everything in there is committed. If it's identified in there, it has funding to move forward. New York State also has some statewide programs that allow municipalities or other agencies to compete for targeted funds. You probably heard of Bridge New York, Pave New York, congestion mitigation, so CMAQ, TAP. There's various programs. So we sometimes get funding through those. And there are several federal programs that are portioned by formula to larger urban areas, including the Rochester area. So then we get projects into our transportation improvement program. That is the schedule of projects, or I should say program project includes project schedule, project cost, project revenues, and that allows the federal funds to flow to the individual projects. The TIP, we have the programming of the regional planning targets, but then there's also the statewide funding awards, like the rail projects we just talked about a few minutes ago. And then any other funds apportioned to the urban area. For example, the FTA section 5307 is transit funds for large urban areas. So RTS Monroe gets a slug of funds by formula from the federal government. So those funds are included as a revenue source, identified projects. So as I alluded to in the first step, there's also some discretionary funds that come directly from the federal government to regions. We were very successful a few years ago getting Tiger funds to support the city Interloop East project that filled in the Interloop, and then the Amtrak station upgrade. Those were some federal discretionary funds that came directly to the region. So now to some of the better news. On November 15th, President Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA. This replaces the FAST Act and authorizes surface transportation programs for the next 5 years, and overall provides $567.5 billion in guaranteed transportation funding over those 5 years across the country. Getting into the weeds a little bit, but IIJA provides contract authority from the Highway Trust Fund that's programmed or funded primarily through motor fuels tax. But the contract authority basically allows the state to commit funds, and they're going to be funded out of the Highway Trust Fund. Of this, $318.6 billion is going for highway programs, which is a 41% increase over the FAST Act, and $70 billion are going for transit programs, which is a 43% increase over the FAST Act. IIJA also provides advanced appropriations. We talked about, how the federal government has their annual appropriations process. Well, IIJA says, okay, the appropriations are already approved for 5 years for certain programs. And the balance of the funds outside of the Highway Trust Fund are covered by the general fund, and those general fund revenues are subject to the annual appropriation process in Congress. So it gets a little tricky depending on which program you're working with. The IIJA does maintain a commitment to existing core programs for highways, but it increases the funds. So you'll see up here National Highway Performance Program, Surface Transportation Block Group, Highway Safety. These are traditional programs that are continuing and have increased in funding. But then there's also some new formula programs that reflect the priorities of administration and Congress. Can you go to the next slide, the new programs? There we go. Okay, so you'll see a carbon reduction program, a Protect is a resiliency type program, additional funding for bridges and electric vehicles. Unfortunately, the continuing resolution that I mentioned earlier is stopping USDOT staff from moving forward on the rulemaking process for these new programs. They can only work on existing programs. So hopefully we get a full budget annual appropriation before the February 18th deadline and can actually put the new funds to use. So on that diagram I showed a few minutes ago, there was a direct line. The federal level of TIP via discretionary programs. Again, there's some commitments to the existing programs, but also new discretionary programs. These new discretionary programs, again, can't start going until the rulemaking cannot start on those until the continuing resolution is resolved. So a significant amount of funding that we won't be able to tap immediately. It'll take some time, and I imagine even in the first year of the bill, it's going to take time to get that money rolled out, so they'll probably push it out into the years 2 through 5. The IIJA also affects metropolitan planning, so essentially the GTC operations. Of note, there is significant increase in funding to support the metropolitan planning. And you'll see there was a 22.3% increase for that federal highway planning funds. But the way they're distributed to New York State and then to the regions within New York State, GTC, we've already seen a 36.6% increase from, 36.3% increase from what we were anticipating. And that was a flatline projection from last year. So the UPWP committee worked through the new funding. They're recommending holding some funding in reserve to see what comes out of the rulemaking process, so that, you know, from April 1st of 2022 to March 31st, 23, we're able to respond to what comes out of the rulemaking and not have our funds tied up and having to wait until April of 2023 to work on it. On the Federal Transit Administration side of the planning funds, the national increase is 72.5%, and New York State being one of the largest transit states in the country fares very well out of this program. We're waiting to see what the funding amounts will be as part of the appropriation process, but there's potential for some significant increase for transit planning funds for GTC. And when we find out what that's going to be, we'll work with the UPWP Development Committee, with the Planning Committee, and then have to come back to this board with any strategy of how we're going to use it, because we'll have to amend the UPWP to these funds. So we did already get an estimate for the current year. Our flatline projection was up about $4,300. So even without that new bill, just the way the formulas work, NISA estimated a little bit extra for us, and that's easily absorbed in the projects that were already up for consideration. $4,300 was recommended to go towards the ongoing analysis that RTS does with the various routes and making sure that as they make refinements on a quarterly basis, they have some support staff to get that done. So one of the things that's new for IIJA is a requirement that we use a minimum of 2.5% of our FHWA planning funds on complete streets planning. I'll be honest, I don't recall ever having set aside of our planning funds for a particular program, so this is new. But complete streets is not new to GTC. We've been supportive of these concepts for many years, but not as a standalone task. Going forward, in the next UPWP, will show it as a separate activity, so it has more visibility as complete streets planning. Don't know what form our efforts will take, but I suspect it'll probably be a mix of staff time and working with some community stakeholders. There's an organization in Rochester, Reconnect Rochester, that supports what's called Complete Streets Makeover, where they'll go into a neighborhood street and re-envision what it might be, and then they use what they call tactical urbanism, where you're putting temporary things out there. It could be hay bales, it could be signs, it could be paint on the asphalt to try to re-envision what it could be. And you know, there's a potential to support that. City of Rochester, the first intersection that they did was then turned into, they're designing a new capital project to make this intersection safer. The before and after analysis, they showed in a presentation a couple weeks ago, and they said before the makeover, what they call the 85th percent speed, so 85% of the cars are going this speed or slower, was 48 miles an hour, and this is just like on a neighborhood street. After they put the changes in, it was down to 18 miles an hour. And when you're a pedestrian or on a bicycle and you get hit by a car, the difference between 18 and 48 is life and death. So pretty significant change there. Moving down, we're still going to need to wait for some guidance, but another new opportunity is factoring in housing considerations in our transportation planning. We don't know what form that'll take and how integrated, but the idea of coordinating with agencies responsible for housing and moving those in. There's also a new emphasis on infrastructure resiliency. This PROTECT program, which I did lay out the acronym on the previous screen. Basically, you think of resiliency. But in preparation for the new program, MPOs can develop a resiliency improvement plan. And if we do this and prioritize projects, the federal share of implementing those projects to our municipalities or counties, whoever is implementing it, goes from 80% to 87%. And if we also incorporate that resiliency plan into our long-range plan, that percentage goes from 87% to 90%. We already have an example where we have our performance measures as a standalone document incorporated by reference. My approach would be to suggest that any resiliency plan we do can be done the same way, so that if we need to alter the resiliency plan, we're not reopening the long-range plan. But by taking on this effort at the planning level, we can then create a 10% increase in federal share for anybody implementing the project. So that's a huge benefit. And this is one of the items that the UPWP Development Committee recognized and said, you know, we don't know what it's going to be, but we'll set aside some funds, recommend that some funds be put into the next annual work program, such that when the guidance comes down, we have funding in place to then take our existing vulnerability assessments that were done using the approach that USDOT worked with FEMA on, which we suspect will be a strong foundation for this program. So we think we have a head start in our region because we've already looked at all the highways, the bridges, the town, the public works maintenance facilities, the salt barns. We've looked at the vulnerability of these different facilities from a natural man-made disaster standpoint. So we think we can relatively easy turn that plan into a compliant resiliency plan and be able to quickly take advantage. You know, if maybe we're first in line, you know, at the state level with a full-blown plan, maybe our communities benefit. So, you know, you look at this, and IIJA represents a significant commitment to improving transportation across the country. And our staff is going to continue to monitor the rollout of any rulemaking, any legislative clarification. And we're going to do whatever we can to best position our region to take advantage of IIJA. And with that, I will try to answer any questions folks might have on the program.
Thanks,
Tim.
Thanks for sharing that level of detail. It sounds encouraging for opportunities.
Yeah, it's a big change and big opportunities, and certainly infrastructure is key. It's, I guess, a bit disappointing how political it got, but it really is to everyone's advantage to work together and do what we can to help the region.
Thank you very much.